Hello and welcome to this round 8 of Grand Prix Stockholm, and we have Martin Müller of Denmark. He's not had to travel too far to get here, up against Löwe Rask, and it's Storm versus Hardened Scales. So each of these decks has had spectacular success in the modern format in the last few years, but Hardened Scales, comparatively speaking, the new hotness.
The new hotness for sure, and a deck that can put on a really quick clock. However, in most games, it's slower than the Storm deck. You can think of Hardened Scales as a more resilient affinity deck in that sense. Sometimes you still get those insane attack with a 5/5 Inkmoth Nexus on turn 2 kind of draws, but usually your win percentage comes from grinding out games with Hardened Scales animation module. These cards not at their best against Storm.
And Martin Müller, he's got a bit of experience with Storm. This was the deck that he elected to play at the last Pro Tour. He was in the modern seat for Pro Tour 25th anniversary, and the list of Storm that he was running there was also running Pyromancer Ascension, and I believe that he's chosen to run that back for this tournament.
Yeah, that's true. I think he's just stuck to the same deck here, and he's exploiting one of the weaknesses of the Hardened Scales deck. Hardened Scales in Game 1 is a non-interactive deck. You're not trying to disrupt much of what your opponent is doing. That's actually, in my opinion, one of the big weaknesses of the Hardened Scales deck. If your clock is not fast enough, then you're pretty dead to the more extreme combo decks of the format.
And this is certainly one of those. With a Goblin Electromancer in play, in principle, the Storm deck could go off right here. It gets to make all of its spells cheaper, and when its spells are generating mana, drawing cards, it can generate a huge amount of velocity just from that one Electromancer. The good news for Martin Müller here is that I don't think that he really even needs to try and go off here. He can spend an extra turn playing a little bit of setup, dealing with things, and seeing where things go.
So this is really interesting because Martin Müller has to really carefully announce his grape shot. And I think he didn't do that particularly well. You have to put the original grape shot on the Arcborn Worker so that the trigger copy kills the Steel Overseer before any kind of modular happens. So just for those grape shot players, it can be a pretty tricky card. Same thing if you're trying to kill Scavenging Ooze.
So Martin Müller there, in some respects, having kind of a weird little turn, not trying to do anything major, just trying to slow down what was going on for Löwe here. The Rask is able to get a couple more permanents on the battlefield. He gets a new Arcbound Worker alongside Arcbound Ravager, and those two have been playing nice together since the very release of Darksteel. Meanwhile, though, an interesting card from Müller, Noxious Revival, to just put a card from graveyard on top of library.
Yeah, and I think he has announced here that he will shuffle again. So that's why we didn't see him shuffle his deck properly after the Scalding Tarn, if you were wondering.
Now, Gifts Ungiven, this is one of the cards that give this deck incredible velocity. It costs only 3 once you've got an Electromancer in play, and here you get to search for all of the elements of the game that you need pretty much to finish things off. It seems crazy that you'd be able to get to the sort of storm count that you need off just one spell like this, but because of Past in Flames letting you cast all your cards from the graveyard again, it lets you set up some absolutely crazy turns here. So Manamorphose, when you have a Goblin Electromancer in play, is spend 1 mana, generate 2 mana, and draw a card. And with more rituals, being able to set up Past in Flames ought to be relatively straightforward for Müller here, at which point we could see this game end this very turn.
Oh, I absolutely expect that to happen. Martin not only got to cast Gifts Ungiven with an Electromancer in play, he's also holding Past in Flames. So this is effectively a lock. Martin is playing very, very quickly. I understand that he understands he has the game locked at this point. Still, it shouldn't influence the let's say clarity of the board state in any way, or of the game state, I should say.
So initially playing lots of rituals from his graveyard, generating Storm and a lot of red mana, Conveniently, there is Manamorphose there in the graveyard in order to be able to also generate blue mana.
And that's the critical part. There's also the Noxious Revival, which you don't even need here, but which can be kind of a nice trick as well.
And ultimately, Lerva does not make Martin go through all the motions there. To be honest, normally at the point at which a Gifts Ungiven gets cast, if there's any amount of extra gas in the tank, either in the graveyard or in hand for the Storm player, it's almost deterministic that they've won the game when an opponent is tapped out like that.
It does depend on the amount of mana you have left. So what you need to be able to do in the most general scenarios is you Gifts Ungiven for Past in Flames, Manamorphose, Pyretic Ritual, and Desperate Ritual. And then in 95% of cases, the correct play is to give the opponent Manamorphose and Past in Flames, because your only chance is that you can limit their mana. Mm-hmm. All the other plans, if you put Past in Flames in the graveyard, it's just effectively there anyway to be flashed back. So then the Storm player does need a few extra mana to cast Past in Flames with the red floating, and that's the only thing you have to calculate.
Yeah, more often than not, it works out that by the time that Gifts Ungiven's being cast, they don't need to rely on an opponent making a suboptimal decision to be able to win, but certainly useful to get that insight, because I know that you've played a fair amount of various iterations of Storm.
Oh yes, I have. Actually, for a long time. I also played... I didn't play this newer version excessively, but it hasn't changed so much from back in the day when I stopped playing when humans started to become really popular. That was when I stopped playing Storm, when humans became really popular, because the humans matchup was a big problem, and a lot of players were still playing Eldrazi Tron with those Thought-Knot Seers and Chalices in the main deck. So, two matchups that I wasn't happy with facing.
Though the addition of Pyromancer Ascension, it's done a little bit to allow this deck to adjust its game plan. After sideboarding, if it wants to, it can become a pretty interactive red-blue deck if it that sort of just leans a little bit more on board control and then eventually wins with something less explosive than it might try in game one.
Yeah, and the value generated by Pyromancer Ascension is actually insane in these games. Enchantment's still pretty difficult to deal with in Modern. Not a lot of decks have easy, clean answers to enchantments. Of course, the cards exist that deal with enchantments, but the cost of playing them is too high relative to what you get.
And thinking of it, that's potentially one of the reasons that Hardened Scales has found itself in a good spot in the metagame. It has won a GP recently, but yeah, Hardened Scales, another key enchantment. You can put it into play on turn one, and if you do so, everything that deck does, as one might expect, one would hope for a deck that's named after an individual card, everything it does just gets spectacularly better with that enchantment in play. And
it's funny because when you look at Ancient Grudge, that is a card that you're super happy to have against the artifact-heavy decks, because if you want to destroy one artifact, there are usually a lot more artifacts you want to destroy. With enchantments, it's very different. Every deck can have a 1 of enchantment or a 2 of enchantment, and then you cannot afford to overboard with effects that only destroy enchantments. You need to play these more flexible cards, for example, Reclamation Sages, but that's, on the face of it, not a powerful Modern card. It's just a versatile effect.
Yeah, and even though it's a versatile effect, worth noting that there are plenty of decks in Modern that don't care at all if you have enchantment removal. And if you had something like a Reclamation Sage main deck in your Elves deck, which would be a reasonable thing to consider, there will certainly be games that you draw it where it's just a 2/1 creature for 3, which is deeply unexciting.
Which is almost like a mulligan in such a high powered format.
So plenty of time left for these next couple of games here. Leatherass getting a good old shuffle on for his Hardened Scales deck going into game 2. And if you're Martin Mueller playing Storm here, obviously being on the play makes life a little bit easier, because effectively you get to go off a turn later with more resources if you want to. How much is life going to change for him after sideboarding here, do you think, in terms of what he's expecting to face from his opponents?
The general matchup doesn't change, but suddenly there are damping spheres to consider, and you can expect Hardened Scales to have 3 or 4 damping spheres in the sideboard. Otherwise, the Storm matchup is too big of a problem, and it has some additional side effects, of course, against Tron, and also some other decks where you wouldn't even think think of in the first place.
Yeah, Damping Sphere, the two effects of the Damping Sphere, in some respects, hit quite different decks in a lot of cases. In one case, you've got decks that want to play a lot of spells that don't like those spells getting more expensive. In another case, you've got decks that have lands that tap for a lot of mana that might only want to cast one big thing.
Yeah, and when I realized how good Damping Sphere is against the Amulet Bloom deck, for example, that's just a very funny thing, because it's clearly not designed to punish the Amulet Bloom deck, but if you're playing all these bounce lands, well, Damping Sphere is huge.
Hardened Scales on turn 1 for Leverask. This is where a lot of the best starts from this deck come from. Steel Overseer on turn 2 will potentially be able to throw out a lot of counters if Lerva gets a lot more creatures in play on these subsequent turns. We can already see that there's a Damping Sphere in hand, a Larkbound Worker in hand. He's got all sorts of things going here, and I think there might even be a Mox to mean that he can cast both of them in the same turn. Yeah,
the Mox, different from Affinity, the Mox is usually not active right away. You need a really extreme draw to have a turn 1 active Mox with this deck. And then even then those draws are probably not the best, because you have to start with a colorless land, and you've drawn a Welding Jar, one of the weaker pieces of the deck.
All right, so Darksteel Citadel, that's one of the ways that the Mox can be that much easier to get online. Here's Arcbound Worker. You can see now each time that Lerva plays a spell, he's kind of holding it above the battlefield briefly in the thought that maybe there's counter magic. Once he doesn't see it on the first thing, he just throws down that Damping Sphere. And Damping Sphere will make life problematic for Martin Müller.
And this board, believe it or not, is very likely already threatening a lethal Inkmoth Nexus if Rask draws an Arcbound Ravager. That's how huge the Hardened Scales impacts the math.
Yeah, I mean, Damping Sphere doesn't do nothing against Lerva if he's looking to have one of those big turns, but it certainly has more impact on what Martin's trying to achieve here. So Rask there, just using a die to indicate how many spells have been cast by Martin Müller this turn, so that the appropriate Damping Sphere tax can be paid on each of them. So even something as simple as an Ancient Grudge will now cost 3 mana.
Still a lot less of a problem than, for example, Eidolon of Rhetoric. At least you can still cast additional spells if you wish to do so.
Yeah, I mean, if we think about even the simple Grape Shot play that was set up in Game 1 by Martin Müller, even that gets a little dicey when it comes to subsequent turns. So this second Manamorphose, it's generating 2 mana, but the next spell will cost 2 more mana. So in some respects, it's just card drawing for Martin here.
Martin knows that he doesn't have much time. He needs to find an Abrade or something similar to deal with the Damping Sphere before Rask draws one of these game-winning cards like the Arcbound Ravager.
So no play there for Rask. He has a Mox in hand, but with a Mox in play, he doesn't really need that one. Another copy of Damping Sphere, though, that could make life problematic.
Very problematic, in fact.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the nature of the answers in Martin Müller's deck are. If he's got something like Shattering Spree, that's one that he might be able to just use to blow up lots of artifacts on Rask's side of the board here.
A single Shattering Spree. It's not too many copies.
Though I guess that you can Gifts Ungiven, and if you get Gifts Ungiven with it, Noxious Revival,
then I put
Past in Flames.
Oh.
I mean, it's not pretty, but...
No, because if you're under Damping Sphere, you're not going to Past in Flames into anything reasonable. Unless you have infinite mana, but that's not usually the case. Let's see what Martin's plan is. Because as far as we know, he only has that one Noxious Revival.
But if it's Noxious Revival, Abrade, Shattering Spree, something.
Yeah.
We start to get somewhere where we can put together a pile that looks interesting.
So if he didn't play 2 Abrades, but if he played 1 Abrade, 1 Ancient Grudge, then he could actually make a pile of 4 Artifact Hate cards. Because repealing a Damping Sphere is, well, not gonna solve your issues, I believe.
Okay, what have we got? We have not got Noxious Revival.
Well, Noxious Revival might very well not be in the deck after sideboarding. It's a very easy card to cut.
Shattering Spree, Abrade, Repeal, Past in Flames. Now this is a much more interesting Gifts Ungiven than we saw in Game 1, because this is not about immediately winning the game, it's about generating the right kind of answers to the threats being asked by Lever Rask here.
Mm-hmm. I think giving Müller Past in Flames in hand is an easy choice. And putting Shattering Spree in the graveyard is an easy choice. So it's really only about whether you want Müller to have access to Repeal or Abrade. And actually, you might think, well, Abrade destroys something, so it's strictly the better card. But this Repeal is deceptively powerful as well, because Müller would be able to pass the turn, end of turn repeal a Damping Sphere, and then if he has something else to deal with an artifact, he's threatening to go off through one sphere and killing it during his combo turn.
So Rask has come to a similar conclusion to you, which is that 2 out of these 4 cards are easy to place.
Yeah, this was the easy part. I would say giving Müller the Repeal is the most obvious split. Because, like I said, Abrade kills an artifact. Why would you give Müller that? But here you can see that Rask's reasoning is exactly what I described. This Repeal is actually, in a sense, it's more powerful. It's threatening the more powerful stuff, and Müller needs something very powerful to get out of the spot he's in. So I like this. It's a bit counterintuitive, but I think it's the better decision. The one Abrade, you know about, you can play around, and that's it. That's that.
So tapping blue to begin things here. Baral, Chief of Compliance. So the next spell will cost 1 less, but also 2 more. So effectively, this opt now costing 2 to cast.
Mm-hmm. And then Müller still has, of course, Lervis' turn to cast another spell.
Yeah, Baral, an interesting one to play as the first spell. I can kind of see the appeal of it if you know that you're going to be casting spells on both your turn and your opponent's here.
But Müller is, I think, might be getting punished here by a top deck Dismember.
Well, he has a Fiery Impulse to mean that he can limit... I guess it's going to be difficult even to limit the amount of damage he's taking here, because there will almost certainly be the opportunity to do things with this Inkmoth Nexus and Arcbound Worker tokens.
Well, now Rask is actually exposing his Inkmoth Nexus, which I think is his best... Well, not his best card on the battlefield, but his best threat on the battlefield, so...
So here comes Dismember. Does Martin Müller want to respond to this one? Get a spell off while he has the mana to do so? Dismember, massively flexible removal spell. That for Phyrexian mana means that anyone gets to play it if they so choose.
The tricky decision here for Martin is that he doesn't really need the mana from Baral right now, as long as the Damping Spheres are in play, but he also knows that he's very likely not winning with as long as there are any number of Damping Spheres on the battlefield.
So for now, Müller just having to play a land and pass things back. 1 Damping Sphere left in play.
Löwe drew another threat, which is Steel Overseer, and that is threatening to pump the team very, very quickly.
Fiery Impulse there takes down the Inkmoth Nexus. Yeah, Steel Overseer with Hardened Scales in play, putting 2 counters on every creature on Löwe's side of the battlefield, because all of his creatures are artifact creatures.
At least it's not Archmont Ravager. That would have been a lot scarier for Müller. Although this turn he would have been ready with that Fiery Impulse. Although, no, Löwe I think could have even played around that if he felt like going for it, because of how Archmont Worker and Archmont Ravager interact.
So Müller has done a pretty good job here of getting through to the mid and indeed late game. Löwe by having brought in Damping Spheres, yes, he's made it much harder for Martin to go off, but at the same time, it has had an impact on he's been able to get going this game himself.
Because of the cards that he sided out for those Damping Spheres, of course, yeah. If Müller has a 7th land, we might just see land Past in Flames Abrade. The weakest Past in Flames ever, but you gotta do what you gotta do. Oh, okay.
That works too.
That's actually a play that conserves 1 mana that Müller didn't have, so it's even better.
And it may well just not matter because here's an Arcbound Ravager. Sometimes you just have it all. So this Arcbound Ravager comes in with 2 counters. Whenever he sacrifices an artifact, he's getting 2 more counters on the Arcbound Ravager. At some point, he sacrifices the Ravager itself, puts lots of counters on one of his creatures that's not got Summoning Sickness, attacks in for the win. Couldn't be easier.
Yep, well fought by Martin, but ultimately 2 Damping Spheres and a bit of pressure. Not too much, but a tiny bit of pressure. Enough to close out the game.
All right, well, for Martin Müller and Löwe Rask, it is going to be one more game that will decide who's going to be playing tomorrow and who's going to be maybe looking toward the PTQ, looking to draft, maybe looking to check out what's going on all around Stockholm. And if you're Martin Müller, you can get on your bike and ride back home as well. We've already determined that's a perfectly reasonable cycle ride.
Back to Denmark.
If this was a GP in Malmö, it would be a really straightforward ride straight across the bridge. I'm less certain that it's a reasonable one from Stockholm.
Yeah. I take that back. I think Malmö is the one where you just have to cross the bridge. And
yeah, it was one of the first GPs that I ever did coverage on, and I got very, very confused when, as it turns out, the best possible way of traveling to Malmö is to fly to Copenhagen and then, head across the bridge. All right, so some small bits of sideboarding going on here. As previously noted, at least for Martin, there is room to adjust the entire tenet of how his deck plays going into subsequent games. We saw there a little bit of the potency of what he can set up by having a pretty diverse sideboard and being able to then utilize Gifts Ungiven. I mean, even just the likes of seeing Fiery Impulse, that's a card that is worse than Lightning Bolt in almost every respect, except for the fact that it's a card that you can fetch alongside Lightning Bolt when you're doing things with Gift Ungiven. We've seen that he has a snow-covered island in his deck. Yes, that means that all of those unstable lands that he has don't look quite as neat on the battlefield when he's got one island that stands out, but it means that in principle, if you're casting a Gifts Ungiven, you can fetch 2 different cards that are functionally island but have different names. All sorts of interesting deck building concessions that go on when you're building with Gifts Ungiven.
Yeah, from my experience, you almost never fetch for island and snow-covered island. You do often put, or not often, but you sometimes put a land into your gift piles because all you need is mana, and then you don't care if your opponent gives you a land or a ritual. Ultimately, you're going to have that extra mana for sure.
These players just finishing their shuffling up here as we go to our decider. Plenty of time left on the clock, and if we get time and there's matches still going, we will show you a little bit of the other matches going on here as we hit the final stages in day 1 of Grand Prix Stockholm. We will, of course, have all of the play in day 2 as well, going from our round 9 all the way through to someone lifting a trophy in this modern format. Now, in this deciding game, it will be Müller that's on the play. I feel like both these players can deploy really meaningful things in the first few turns here. So being on the play definitely gives you a bit of a tempo boost, but there's nothing to say that that's going to be unstoppable from Löwe's side of things.
No, but Löwe is still, after Cyber, is still not an interactive deck. sure, the two dismembers and the full playset of damping spheres changes the dynamic of the matchup, but Löwe still wants to present the fastest clock and just enough disruption so that Martin doesn't just go off. If I'm the Storm player in this kind of spot, I want to see Baral or Goblin Electromancer just play it on turn 2 and threaten a win. And your opponent doesn't know what you'll have. So if they have a removal spell, they have to immediately cast it because the risk is so high.
Well, it looks like that's exactly what Martin Müller can threaten with his opening 7. On the other side of things, there is a Dismember in hand for Löwe, and he keeps that one. An initial sleight of hand, getting another ritual for Martin Müller here, so that will mean that if he's going to do one of those big storm turns, he's going to have that much more potency. He's got Gifts Ungiven. I believe that he does have Baral as well, so most of the puzzle already assembled here for Martin Müller. Meanwhile, it's an Ancient Stirrings on turn 1 from Rask, and this finds him the piece of disruption that he's really going to need if he's going to get to the mid stages of this game safe.
Now, once again, you see that this is not the perfect Mox Opal deck. It's not possible to enable it on turn 1.
Yeah, I know that there were some builds that toyed around with all sorts of zero-cost creatures, and I think that as people were gradually migrating from thinking of this deck being an affinity deck, there were a lot of changes that ended up taking place. In Affinity, there are a whole bunch of cards that you play towards having your big explosive start that just aren't that big a deal when it comes to what you're doing with Hardened Scales.
No. It looks like Löwe is on a very classic list. I see that he cleaned up the non-basic lands a little bit. I don't see Phyrexian Core there anymore, but instead a second Blinkmoth Nexus. Not a bad choice. The creature lands are still some of the best colorless non-basics you can play. And then the sideboard is relatively standard as well.
So Baral, Chief of Compliance, is in play here, and he definitely presents a sizable threat.
So now Löwe can play an artifact and a Dismember. But if he casts a Damping Sphere, then he has to Dismember on Martin's upkeep.
Yeah, it is a symmetrical effect, of course. A Walking Ballista on 1 here, followed by a Dismember.
Mm-hmm. No real need to deploy the Damping Sphere this turn. Also, Walking Ballista can actually sometimes be surprisingly relevant because it threatens to shoot down, especially Goblin Electromancer, at instant speed.
Yeah, I mean, for the Storm deck, these early turns are always set up, but missing a land drop there for Martin Müller, a bit of a pain because one of the choke points for the deck is mana.
The biggest choke point almost. Everything you're doing is centered around mana in the end.
Yeah, I mean, when you're trying to get a Storm count of up to 20, one of the most difficult things to do is making sure you can cast that many spells.
So now, if a Ravager enters the battlefield, then Löwe is not losing to a Baral. Or he doesn't have to lose to a Baral anymore. And he could deploy Damping Sphere in the same turn, which is probably safer than going for 2 Ravagers. They're kind of redundant anyway.
Yeah, definite diminishing returns at least on subsequent Ravagers after the first one. Always going to be playing a Ravager first regardless of what the second spell is, because you really don't want to cast a Damping Sphere first if you're planning on doing a whole lot yourself later on in the turn.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard to cast 2 Ravagers if your first play is not a Ravager.
Yes. All right, so here we have a little bit of thought there, going for Inkmoth Nexus before another copy of Outbound Ravager here.
Okay. Basically ignoring the piece of hate that he found on turn 1. I understand the reasoning because the Ravagers, once you have a critical mass, are threatening lethal with the Inkmoth Nexus. Oh, interesting. Now Martin is killing the Walking Ballista.
So Fiery Impulse, Spell Mastery has been achieved thanks to those 2 copies of Sleight of Hand. So this is essentially Lightning Bolt being pointed at Walking Ballista. And in order for Löwe to keep it alive, he would have to essentially sacrifice his board, which seems an unrealistic expectation.
I don't think that we will see this. Also, Martin missed his land drop. Oh wow. I mean, I have to say, Martin is making this play, allowing this to happen, and I think it's actually good for him. He's not happy to have a walking ballista there, but now he can just point an abrade at the walking ballista, and he's quite far ahead, because suddenly the threat of Inkmoth Nexus, actually all the threats are so much lower. Then we'll get into this pattern of Löwe playing a hate piece, but having one measly point of damage on the battlefield, or maybe two.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we've seen come up time and again in this modern format, that some of the most successful decks are the ones that can disrupt to some extent, but do so while having a reasonable way of closing out games.
Yeah, the reason that I really disagree with this is that Löwe had the correct line in mind. He said to himself, okay, I have a walking ballista, so I'm safe from Baral or Goblin Electromancer if it comes to it. So I will just play my two Ravagers instead of a Ravager and a Damping Sphere. And that's already debatable. But then, if there is a lightning bolt pointed at your walking ballista, it doesn't mean you have to sacrifice 3 permanents to save it. Because it's not like Müller was threatening to go off next turn anyway.
So Steel Overseer, the next spell to come from Löwe here. And Steel Overseer plays very, very nicely with each and every creature in the Hardened Scales list, along with Hardened Scales itself. And there is the much prophesied abrade from Martin Müller, targeting Walking Ballista. And it might as well just send a bunch of damage Martin's way. And then finally sacrificing itself to put a counter on Arcbound Ravager. That way round, you're both dealing the last point of damage, essentially, but you're also meaning that Ravager has just one more counter on it. So that element heads up play.
Müller is, I would say, 2 cards away from him having something that could resemble victory here. A land and a Baral or Electromancer is what he needs.
Yeah, as things stand, the lack of land that has faced Martin Müller here, something of a problem.
I think that Martin wants to cast the Grape Shot on Steel Overseer. And then he will have Abrade again for the upcoming turns when it's when Inkmoth Nexus becomes scary. And because of this, Müller is on 13, so Löwe knows the Arcbound Ravager alone won't make it, which might entice him to make a 5/5 Inkmoth Nexus, just get in there. He sees one Abrade in the yard. It's safe from Grape Shots or 3 damage spells. So it's not really a bad line, but it would run into the second Abrade if Löwe doesn't play around it. Yeah,
this is definitely a key point of interaction that we've seen so far in this match.
Absolutely. There's also the decision whether to cycle Manamorphose first. Not really because you want an additional point of damage, but because if you can draw a land or a 2-mana creature, you would much rather have those than the plays that are currently available. On the other hand, the cost of losing a Manamorphose is also very real.
Yeah, these are the elements that really differentiate the strongest Storm players. I think it's one of those decks that you will have games where it feels difficult to lose. You'll have games where it feels almost impossible to win. But then those ones in between, there are a few where you really get a chance to see the true masters with this deck doing their thing.
Yeah, ultimately Müller deciding that he would pass again.
Now, he didn't know about this Damping Sphere from Ancient Stirrings on the first turn.
He did.
Okay, some big old swings coming through here. At what point does Müller choose to pull the trigger on something this turn?
And what's his game plan if he doesn't kill the Damping Sphere? Now that he's committed to not play Manamorphose, he's not really in a position to just find all the missing pieces in one draw step. There's this weird line, Tim, where you are where you have a mana creature in hand but only 2 mana, so you ritual Manamorphose, play the creature, and still have enough rituals to go off. But that's a very rare case.
Yeah, this is a really interesting spot because Löwe doesn't have lethal this turn but can make it close. He can put Martin Müller in virtual check, I suppose. And it's not even a particularly risky line here because he doesn't have to go all in on the Ravager to do so. And then if the Ravager dies, it has good things that it can work onto. So the Abrade does come down on Damping Sphere itself.
And that's the logical play. Now Müller has the extra land. He has a cycler. He can also... Oh, he can't get the Storm Cone high enough, and that would also not be very helpful. I was thinking if there's a way to just have a good grape shot here, but that's not possible. Also, against Arcbound Ravager, it's almost never possible.
At least it's Arcbound Ravager with a tapped out opponent who can't animate their Inkmoth Nexus.
Yeah, but if you grape shot, then Steel Overseer or Arcbound Ravager survives for sure. And also you're depleting all your resources. No, I think this has to hit gold.
Yeah. Desperation Manamorphose. Well, it's a land, and it's a better land than the island that he had previously as an option.
Okay, that's not too much of an upgrade, I'm afraid.
Yeah, the only card drawing left available to Martin Müller in hand is that Gifts Ungiven.
So, yeah, the Inkmoth Nexus is definitely threatening lethal, and okay, Martin is facing lethal on in damage and in poison. I think this is not going to end well.
Now, if you're Löwe and you see things play out the way they have here, that grape shot on Still Overseer, almost a signal that the door is open for him to take this win, and indeed his position in day 2. Arcbound Worker, enough to just make it a slightly easier set of maths. And ultimately, the handshake there going to Löwe Rask. He gets the 2-1 victory. He advances to 6-2, 6-2. The exact record needed to make it into day 2. Martin Müller, well, on your bike, son. So these guys are just obviously finishing things up, but we will get a chance to get a little bit more going on here because I believe that there's either a little bit more magic going on in our feature match area, or we might even get a chance to talk to Luis Salvato. So we've just heard that there's no more magic in our feature match area, but you see walking behind Löwe Rask there, Luis Salvato. He's going to be heading across to the booth, and he's looking pretty pleased with himself. We'll find out the details of exactly why that might be as he sits down. Luis, we've got a headset right here for you. If you put it on, then everyone at home will be able to hear exactly how your day has gone. You came across here knowing that this is going to be potentially a very big day for your Magic career. How has it gone?
Perfect.
Perfect. So
yes.
by that, I understand that this is going to be an 8-0 record for you on day 1?
Yes, 8-0 record, playing Modern. That I like a lot the format.
It's a format that's been pretty kind to you this season.
Yes, it was, and it's been really nice. And I also like a lot my deck, and I know how to play it, so...
Blue-White Control, it seems to have been kind of the consensus pick for a lot of pros that have come along to this tournament. The power of Teferi alongside Jace, not to be denied, it would seem.
Yeah, both planeswalkers are really good. Teferi, I like to play 2 Teferis because you can catch all the cards that can bother you. It's really powerful, and you easily when you go up. So
Yeah. In some respects, it's one of the planeswalkers that it has a very straightforward line of play. If you have something that you're terrified of, maybe you minus.
yeah.
If you can go for the ultimate, fine. But the rest of the time, up he goes.
Yes.
And in terms of what you have to do on this weekend, one consideration that you no longer need to think about is Reed Duke, who also travelled across the Atlantic this weekend. He had not had a particularly good time with his Abzan list, so it's a fairly straightforward target for you now. In terms of what you need to do, it's just about looking towards that top 8, seeing if you can track down Seth.
Yes. It was like really good to have Raid here, but his position was also really hard because he needed like the top 4 at least. Now I didn't know he already dropped for the tournament, or
He's already picked up his third loss, so
okay.
he will be not in day 2. You only have essentially you're in one of those weird kind of marathons where everyone else that's running is just they're going in a slightly different direction to you.
But the harder opponent is Seth.
Yes.
He's in his house. I don't know if he's watching.
I would guess that he's at least paying a vague, small amount of attention to what's going on. Hi, Seth, if you're watching. Feel free to sound off in the chat if you want to say hello. If not, that's on you. You'll be all right. We will both see you soon enough in Las Vegas, because I presume that the rest of your team is already, if not in Las Vegas, traveling there pretty soon.
Yeah. All the team will travel on Monday or maybe Sunday, a few one. So we will meet each opponent from Team Series and for the Worlds, like the next weekend.
And
the next week.
For you, how big a decision was it to come to this event versus maybe just focusing on the World Championship? Because there are a lot of different balls in the air for you in terms of things that you could potentially achieve in this next 7 days or so.
Well, the thing is, I already was outside my home since like 5 weekends.
Oh, wow.
So, and the previous GPs didn't go very well, and Seth also made the top 8. So I was in a position where I need to come here, because you never know when you are in the Player of the Year race, and you need to take all the opportunities. And also I like Modern.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I didn't spend too many days testing Modern, since I have a lot of experience with the deck since the Pro Tour. And the last few days I was playing Standard and some random Dominaria draft, so I think I'm preparing in a properly way to the Worlds, so I only use this weekend to travel and play. So.
Fantastic stuff. Well, the Player of the Year race will be concluded one way or another tomorrow. In terms of your mental energy, I want to make sure you get plenty of time to sleep, both for today and for the week that's coming ahead. Yeah. So I'll bid you guys at home adieu. We will get a chance to see more Modern from this man, Luis Salvato, tomorrow. Potentially we will have him, but one way or another, someone will be Player of the Year tomorrow, and indeed we'll have a champion here in Stockholm, Sweden. It's good night from us. We will see you all again tomorrow after these messages.
See you there.